This is Al Claiborne. Today is November 17, 2025. 60 years ago, on November 17, 1965, an overwhelming force of North Vietnamese Army regulars attacked a column of 425 American soldiers near Landing Zone Albany in Pleiku Province, South Vietnam. The column was covering the 3-kilometer distance from Landing Zone X-Ray, where the 3-day battle depicted in the film We Were Soldiers Once and Young had ended the day before. Among the 155 Americans who died at LZ Albany was Platoon Sgt. William Ferrell, 38, from Stanton, Tennessee. Platoon Sgt. Ferrell was the first of Haywood County's 14 casualties in the Vietnam War. This video consists of 6 chapters. The first segment covers the first 4.5 years of the Kennedy and Johnson presidencies, January 20th, 1961 to July 28th, 1965. Key foreign policy events are highlighted as We Shall Pay Any Price morphed into We Will Stand in Vietnam. The soundtrack includes excerpts from President Kennedy's inaugural address and from President Johnson's July 28, 1965 press conference. The title of Chapter 1 is The Stage is Set.
Vice President Johnson, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Chief Justice, President Eisenhower, Vice President Nixon, President Truman, Reverend clergy, fellow citizens. We observe today not a victory of party, but a celebration of freedom, symbolizing an end as well as a beginning, signifying renewal as well as change. For I have sworn before you and Almighty God the same solemn oath our forebears prescribed nearly a century and 3/4 ago. The world is very different now, for man holds in his mortal hands the power to abolish all forms of human poverty and all forms of human life. And yet the same revolutionary beliefs for which our forebears fought are still at issue around the globe. The belief that the rights of man come not from the generosity of the state, but from the hand of God. We dare not forget today that we are the heirs of that first revolution. Let the word go forth from this time and place to friend and foe alike that the torch has been passed to a new generation of Americans born in this century, tempered by war, disciplined by a hard and bitter peace, proud of our ancient heritage, and unwilling to witness or permit the slow undoing of those human rights to which this nation has always been committed and to which we are committed today at home and around the world. Let every nation know, whether it wishes us well or ill, that we shall pay any price, bear any burden, meet any hardship, support any friend, oppose any foe to assure the survival and the success of liberty. In the long history of the world, only a few generations have been granted the role of defending freedom in its hour of maximum danger. I do not shrink from this responsibility. I welcome it. I do not believe that any of us would exchange places with any other people or any other generation. The energy, the faith, the devotion which we bring to this endeavor will light our country and all who serve it. And the glow from that fire can truly light the world. And so, my fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. My fellow citizens of the world, ask not what America will do for you, but what together we can do for the freedom of man. Finally, whether you are citizens of America or citizens of the world, ask of us here the same high standards of strength and sacrifice which we ask of you. With a good conscience, our only sure reward, with history the final judge of our deeds, let us go forth to lead the land we love, asking His blessing and His help, but knowing that here on earth, God's work must truly be our own.
My fellow Americans, not long ago I received a letter from a woman in the Midwest. She wrote, "Dear Mr. President, in my humble way I am writing to you about the crisis in Vietnam. I have a son who is now in Vietnam. My husband served in World War II. Our country was at war. But now, this time, it's just something that I don't understand. Why? Well, I've tried to answer that question dozens of times and more in practically every state in this union. I've discussed it fully in Baltimore in April, in Washington in May, in San Francisco in June. And let me again now discuss it here in the East Room of the White House. Why must young Americans, born into a land exultant with hope and with golden promise, toil and suffer and sometimes die in such a remote and distant place? The answer, like the war itself, is not an easy one, but it echoes clearly from the painful lessons of half a century. 3 times in my lifetime, in 2 world wars and in Korea, Americans have gone to far lands to fight for freedom. We have learned at a terrible and a brutal cost that retreat does not bring safety, and weakness does not bring peace. And it is this lesson that has brought us to Vietnam. This is a different kind of war. There are no marching armies or solemn declarations. Some citizens of South Vietnam at times with and repression and murder that would follow. This then, my fellow Americans, is why we're in Vietnam. What are our goals in that war-stained land? First, we intend to convince the communists that we cannot be defeated by force of arms or by superior power. They are not easily convinced. In recent months, they have greatly increased their fighting forces and their attacks and the numbers of incidents. I have asked the commanding general, General Westmoreland, what more he needs to meet this mounting aggression. He has told me, and we will meet his needs. I have today ordered to Vietnam the Airmobile Division and certain other forces which will raise our fighting strength from 75,000 to 125,000 men almost immediately. Additional forces will be needed later, and they will be sent as requested. This will make it necessary to increase our active obligations of justice toward our fellow man. And let me also add now a personal note. I do not find it easy to send the flower of our youth, our finest young men, into battle. I have spoken to you today of the divisions and the forces and the battalions and the units. But I know them all, every one. I have seen them in 1,000 streets of 100 towns in every state in this union, working and laughing and building and filled with hope and life. And I think I know too how their mothers weep and how their families sorrow. And this is the most agonizing and the most painful duty of your president. And there's something else too. When I was young, poverty was so common that we didn't know it had a name. And education was something that you had to fight for. And water was really life itself. I have now been in public life 35 years, more than 3 decades. And in each of those 35 years, I have seen good men and wise leaders struggle to bring the blessings of this land to all of our people. And now, I am the president. It is now my opportunity to help every child get an education, to help every Negro and every American citizen have an equal opportunity, to help every family get a decent home, and to help bring healing to the sick and dignity to the old. As I have said before, that is what I've lived for. That's what I've wanted all my life since I was a little boy. And I do not want to see all those hopes and all those dreams of so many people for so many years now drowned in the wasteful ravages of cruel wars. And I'm going to do all I can do to see that that never happens. But I also know, as a realistic public servant, that as long as there are men who hate and destroy, we must have the courage to resist, or we'll see it all. All that we have built, all that we hope to build, all of our dreams for freedom, all will be swept away on the flood of conquest. So, too, this shall not happen. We will stand in Vietnam.
Does the fact that you're sending additional forces to Vietnam imply any change in the existing policy of relying mainly on the South Vietnamese to carry out offensive operations and using American forces to guard American installations and to act as an emergency backup?
It does not imply any change in policy whatever. It does not imply any change of objective.
In July 2015, 1st Cavalry Division veteran Thomas Crabtree introduced me to Joe Galloway by email. As a 24-year-old UPI correspondent, Joe covered the November 1965 battle at LZ X-Ray and co-authored the book We Were Soldiers Once and Young with retired Army Lieutenant General Hal Moore. When I mentioned my interest in Platoon Sgt. William Ferrell, who is mentioned in the Moore Galloway book, Joe introduced me by email to Larry Gwynn. Larry met William Pappy Ferrell in Vietnam in October 1965, soon after he became executive officer for Alpha Company, 2nd Battalion, 7th Cavalry Regiment, 1st Cavalry Division. I have had occasional contact with Larry since 2015, and I recently read his Vietnam memoir, Baptism. As will be seen throughout this video, Larry and his work and his friendship with Pappy Ferrell are critical to the story. Chapter 2, First Lieutenant Larry Gwynn. First Lieutenant Larry Gwynn, shown here at An Khê Pass with Highway 19 in the background, left the States for Vietnam on July 29, 1965. On August 7th, he began duty as a MACV advisor, working with the 21st ARVN Division in the Mekong Delta. Over the few days between September 11 and 14, he was assigned to the 2nd Battalion, 7th Cavalry Regiment, 1st Cavalry Division at An Khê. On about October 3rd, he became the executive officer for Alpha Company, 2nd Battalion, 7th Cavalry Regiment, with Captain Joel Sagdinas as the commanding officer. In January 2020, Larry Gwynn wrote to me, "I met Pappy when I was assigned to Alpha Company in October. Pappy was 38-year-old Platoon Sergeant William A. Ferrell from Stanton, Tennessee." In 1999, Larry Gwynn published his Vietnam memoir, Baptism, which includes his very distinct memories of Pappy Ferrell. On December 17, 1996, Larry was interviewed for the West Point Oral History Project. Excerpts from the book and the interview appear in the following with the permission of Larry Gwynn and the West Point Center for Oral History. The Greek historian Plutarch described Julius Caesar's decision to cross the Rubicon in 49 BC as follows: "Then, like one who casts himself from a precipice into a yawning abyss, he closed the eyes of reason and put a veil between them and his peril, and calling out in Greek to the bystanders these words only, 'Let the die be cast,' he set his army across." On August 16, 1965, 19 days after President Johnson's televised announcement that the 1st Cavalry Division was being ordered to Vietnam, the USNS Maurice Rose left Charleston on its month-long journey. Among the passengers aboard the Maurice Rose were Pappy Ferrell and the men of the 2nd Battalion, 7th Cavalry Regiment, 1st Cav. In history, an Army Lieutenant Colonel named George Armstrong Custer had once commanded the 7th Cavalry Regiment. Chapter 3. Pappy Ferrell and the 1st Cav go to Vietnam, August 16th to September 15th, 1965. In August 2015, Larry Gwynn shared this photo of Pappy Ferrell, shown second from left, in Vietnam. Second Lieutenant Pat Payne stands at Pappy's left. As Pat wrote in 2001, Pappy Ferrell was my platoon sergeant and helped me as a young second lieutenant get through the first month in country. I moved over to recon in early November, only weeks before the yard rang and his death. He was truly respected by all of us and is missed by all who knew him. Chapter 4. The Battle at LZ X-Ray, November 14 to 16, 1965. An NVA force of about 3,000 men attacked the 440 men of Lieutenant Colonel Hal Moore's 1st Battalion, 7th Cavalry Regiment of the 1st Cav. The fighting began shortly after noon on the 14th and did not conclude until just before 7 a.m. on the 16th. Bravo Company, 2nd Battalion, 7th Cavalry Regiment of the 1st Cav, joined the fight at about 5 p.m. on the 14th. Larry Gwynn, Pappy Ferrell, and the men of Alpha Company, 2nd Battalion, 7th Cavalry, air assaulted into LZ X-Ray on the morning of the 15th. In his memoir, Larry Gwynn writes, "Fortunately, the battalion had spent most of the previous month in the field, patrolling the scrub-covered plains north of Ankh and getting our SOPs down in the hot, dry sand of Happy Valley. Although we found nothing of significance or concern, we were getting much-needed training in the basics of air mobility. That is, we were getting acclimated, getting used to the jungle, getting ready for what lay ahead." But referring to the battalion's mission a few days later, Gwynn continues, "On November 12, 1965, we flew into the Yadrang Valley of the Central Highlands and began our search. Their orders were to find the enemy, fix him in position, and destroy him. The day before, the battalion had left Ankh in a convoy of trucks, which would travel the 90 miles to Pleiku on Highway 19. Commenting on the absence of 2 of the Alpha Company platoon leaders, Gwynn adds, "That meant our 1st Platoon and Mortar Platoon would be commanded in the field by NCOs, Sergeant First Class James L. Fisher and Platoon Sergeant Harold L. Braden, both experienced platoon sergeants. Bill Sisson and Gordy Grove were fine, though, and both had outstanding platoon sergeants, Charles L. Eschbach and William A. Ferrell, a kind and soft-spoken Tennessean who most of us referred to as Pappy. Second Lieutenant Grove had replaced Lieutenant Pat Payne as leader of 2nd Platoon only days earlier, so Lieutenant Payne and Pappy Ferrell worked together through the month of October. The photo of the two men that appears in the preceding was likely taken during that time frame. Pleiku was the capital of Pleiku Province during the war, and the Plymouth Special Forces camp, which had been attacked violently only a few weeks before, was about 25 miles south of Pleiku. From Plymouth, on Sunday morning, November 14, 1965, Lieutenant Colonel Hal Moore led his 1st Battalion, 7th Cavalry Regiment of the 1st Cav in an air assault at LZ X-Ray, about 14 miles west of Plymouth, at the base of the Chupong Massif in the valley of the Yadrang River. There, surrounded by about 3,000 NVA soldiers, his 440 officers and men fought for survival during more than 40 hours of fierce fighting. Then First Lieutenant Larry Gwynn, Executive Officer of Alpha Company, 2nd Battalion, 7th Cavalry Regiment, added in an August 15th email to me, B Company, Bravo Company, of the 2nd Battalion of the 7th Cavalry flew into X-Ray on the afternoon of November 14th and fought with Hal Moore's battalion during the X-Ray fight. A Company, 2nd Battalion, 7th Cavalry, my company, air assaulted into X-Ray during the fighting on the morning of November 15th. We stayed and fought there until November 17, when we marched to LZ Albany. Pappy Ferrell was with us the whole time. Lieutenant Colonel Robert McDade's other units arrived, relatively fresh, on November 16th. Hal Moore's battalion and some of the 2nd Battalion was flown out that afternoon back to Pleiku. The defense of LZ X-Ray was a costly proposition. The Americans suffered 79 men killed in action and another 121 wounded. At least 634 enemy corpses were found after the fighting ended early on the morning of the 16th. Lieutenant Colonel Moore was later quoted, "By God, they sent us over here to kill communists, and that's what we're doing." The battle is described in exquisite detail in the New York Times bestseller, We Were Soldiers Once and Young, published by Hal Moore and Joe Galloway in 1992, and in the film version that was released in 2002. On the second day, Monday, November 15th, the NVA commander unleashed an assault with perhaps as many as 1,000 men against two positions in the defensive perimeter at X-Ray. At about 6:50 that morning, as Joe Galloway said years later, the bottom fell out. It was 10 a.m. before the surviving NVA began to withdraw. At 9:10 a.m., Captain Joel Sagdinas and a platoon from Alpha, 2nd Battalion, 7th Cavalry arrived at X-Ray. Lieutenant Larry Gwynn described the situation when he landed on the third lift maybe 30 minutes later. The LZ was hot, and it was grazing fire. In his memoir, Larry recalls cooler moments late in the afternoon of the 15th. The captain and I shared the other foxhole, our radios within reach. As we prepared our positions for the night, Gordy Grove and Pappy Ferrell dropped by to pick up C rations and extra ammunition. They were in good spirits, and we chatted for a while. We were all relieved, I think, that the day had gone as well as it had. But as Americans back home absorbed the evening news for Wednesday, November 17, 1965, 155 more 1st Cav troopers had been claimed by the Yadrang. First Lieutenant Larry Gwynn thought to himself early in the morning of November 18th, and Pappy Ferrell, bless his soul, he was one of the best NCOs I'd ever met. Now he was lying somewhere out there in the jungle, probably dead. Chapter 5, LZ Albany, Hell in a Very Small Place. This chapter includes an excerpt from Larry Gwynn's December 17, 1996 interview for the West Point Oral History Project.
If you haven't picked it up by now, it's really not fun talking about this stuff.
I know it's not fun for you, but I would like for you to tell us why it was important, and it was a major turning point for yourself.
Yeah, it was, yeah. Are we back on?
Yeah. So what happened when you got to Albany?
Well, my company, thank God, in retrospect, had the privilege of being the point unit of our battalion out of X-ray. So we were in front of everybody. And the captain had given us very clear instructions, an operations order to travel in a specific way. We had a wedge formation. We knew there were North Vietnamese units in the area. We were expecting to run into them at any minute. So we moved tactically for the 4 or 5 mile trip. Our primary concern was finding the LZ. All we knew was that it was a white dot on a map and had never been there before. So we wanted to make sure that we got to the right place. It was just, everybody was exhausted and carrying all that equipment. And what I didn't appreciate at the time was behind us were other units. The headquarters company had never heard a shot fired in anger. They'd flown in the night of the 16th. We had Delta Company, two platoons. We had Charlie Company, a good unit, but right behind us. And we had an attached company that we didn't even know was A Company, 1st of the 5th. They just happened to be attached to us. So the battalion that left X-ray, the 2nd Battalion, was sort of, they were a little cavalier about the way they traveled. Again, I say, thank God, A Company was ready, because we had been in contact for 48 hours, and we knew you had to be ready. So when we got through the jungle and ran into some North Vietnamese scouts, we were again aware that the enemy was in the area, but for some reason our colonel wanted to interrogate them, and he talked to them for 20 minutes, which gave their compatriots 20 minutes time to run back and tell their bosses that there's an American column of troops heading our way. What do you think we should do? And they formed a very quick and very effective battle plan and started to maneuver against us. After the interrogation, A Company and the rest of the battalion, I guess, picked up, and we walked to LZ Albany, which we could see was a clearing. And Captain Shigdinis, in the proper way, sent our lead platoon across and the other 2 platoons around the LZ just to go around it and secure it in case there were bad guys in the area. And the colonel's entourage walked right through us and into the middle of the landing zone where there was a clump of trees. And after Captain Shigdinis had briefed me, I followed that colonel's entourage, and our mortar platoon followed the colonel's entourage, and we set up with Captain Shigdinis in the clump of trees, waiting for the platoons to go around and secure the area. And all of a sudden, we heard some shooting. And it was from the vicinity of our 1st platoon. And after 2 or 3 single shots, the whole jungle opened up in one massive crescendo of fire. It was like everybody that I knew and everybody behind us was firing every weapon they had. And rounds started coming in right over our heads, and what we had done was we had run into the North Vietnamese, and they had instantaneously attacked us. People describe it as an ambush, but it wasn't. It was a hasty ambush. It was a meeting engagement. We just bungled into them is what we did. And they had 20 minutes jump on us. So they could find anthills to hide behind, and they could tie themselves up in trees so they could shoot down at us. And luckily, I say for the 5th time, A Company had the point. We were in this clump of trees surrounded by clear fields of fire. What we couldn't do was get our platoons back to join us, because when the firing came in, it was so intense that everybody hunkered down in the grass. I remember jumping up when the firing got bad to go to a tree for some cover. And I was looking at the tree, and right in front of my eyes, this chunk of wood comes out of the tree, and I realized that's a bullet that almost took my nose off, and I'm thinking, whoa! So I get back down on the grass, and I run back to where my company commander is and my radios are. And by this time, everybody's aware that we are under very intense fire. And the fire was so intense that most of the battalion casualties, I think, occurred in the first 10 or 15 or 20 minutes. Our 1st platoon was overrun almost instantaneously. We lost all of them, except for 2 fellows who came in later that night. Our 2nd platoon was pinned down by mortar fire, and eventually all but 3 of them were killed. So in the space of 10 or 15 minutes, A Company had lost half its men. And here we were in this clump of trees, surrounded by a couple guys who'd straggled in, the battalion commander and his group, and knew that everywhere you looked, there were North Vietnamese troops. You could see them in the tree line. Luckily, our recon platoon pulled back into our perimeter, so at least we had about 40, 50 guys, and we set up a defensive perimeter, and that's where we fought for the next 5, 6, 8 hours. The rest of the battalion had been strung out behind us, and they were decimated. They were overrun. They were chopped up. C Company lost 101 guys out of a total of 110 that had walked into that valley. So, as I say, in half an hour, the 2nd and 7th was rendered non-combat fit. We didn't know this. All we knew from our position up front was that we were surrounded by North Vietnamese troops. You could see them. You could see them in groups of 20, 30, 40. We were fighting. We were shooting. They would attack our perimeter. We would kill them all, and it was just a horrendous fight. And after about 2 or 3 hours, I think, we got tactical air support and the Air Force A-1E Sky Raiders dropped napalm and basically ringed the entire perimeter up front with napalm, killing hundreds of North Vietnamese soldiers. I mean, I could look across the field, and 150 meters away, I would see a napalm canister toppling down, hit the top of a tree, break open, see the napalm come pouring down, and see North Vietnamese soldiers jumping up and trying to escape. And the jellied gas come down and wipe them all out. I mean, it was just, and I saw that 5, 6, 7 times. It was just awful. After the napalm attacks, which probably took an hour to ring our position, it seemed that the North Vietnamese attack had pulled away. We had hurt them terribly with the napalm. I don't know how many hundreds we killed, but they had pulled back into the jungle, and then another half an hour later, in flies Bravo Company, 2nd Battalion, which hadn't been with us for this march because they had been resting the 1st Battalion back at Camp Holloway. 80 guys flew in and 8 helicopters into an LZ that was in between us and the bad guys. And if I've ever seen a more courageous air assault, I don't know where. In flew, 8 or 10 ships. The soldiers, the 1st Cav soldiers, firing to their left and exiting to their right to come into our position. And the North Vietnamese were still in the woods, and they were shooting up a storm. And it was just amazing. I don't know how many times it took for that group of ships to come in. Some tried and didn't make it and had to fly away. But eventually, about 80 Americans flew right into that small landing zone and saved us, because they came in with fresh troops who'd had a night's rest. They were a wonderful unit, Bravo Company, the hardcore with Myron Dudurick and Rick Rescorla. And they came right into our perimeter and basically took over, because everybody in the perimeter was exhausted and heartsick and just absolutely shell-shocked. So that 4, 5, 6 hours at Albany, I understand from people who have been studying the war, turned out to be the fiercest fight in Vietnam and the American war there. We lost 155 men killed, 124 wounded. There were 4 missing when we left. I don't know how many hundreds of North Vietnamese we killed, maybe 3, maybe 400. It was just, it could well have been the fiercest battle in Vietnam. I don't know, but I wouldn't wish that kind of experience on anybody. Absolutely no one. The Americans did awfully well, considering. But we lost 70% of our people that day in one 12-hour fight. And what has never been satisfactorily explained to me is why weren't we helped earlier? Why were we left out there in that mess? The Vietnamese came back that night and killed a lot of our wounded lying in the grass. So by the time the dust cleared the next day, the North Vietnamese had left, and we had to clean up our dead and wounded, and it took us 2 days to do that. I think everybody who survived that experience has never been the same. And I live with that every day. But I am alive, and I'm lucky. And that's all I want to say about that right now.
I'll ask this. If you really cannot talk about it, just let it be. It was for your action on November 17th that you've won one of the highest honors in the military, the Silver Star. Can you tell us what you did?
I killed a lot of bad guys and helped the good guys I could find. The citation is the citation that I received a couple months ago speaks for itself, but it could never describe the chaos and the madness and the confusion of that fight. And it could never possibly describe the courage of the guys I fought with. Very few people hid their heads in the grass. Most of the guys I saw fighting in Albany were doing their job and doing it incredibly courageously. Overwhelming odds against us. The guys did their job, did the best we could. That's all.
When you saw them and you opened fire, you killed them, what did you say to your men?
Oh. Well, the firefight had been going on for 10 minutes, and we had shifted from A Company's perimeter to the other side to see what was over there, because we really didn't know. And the guys I was with were all down in the grass, hugging the dirt, because there was so much fire coming in. If you stuck your head up, you were dead, basically. And but I was a lieutenant, so I had to know what was going on. So I stuck my head up, and I saw about 40 North Vietnamese soldiers coming across the grass, coming across the landing zone at us. And all I did was say, "Here they come," and start shooting at them. And everybody got the message, and we cranked out a lot of fire, and we killed all the North Vietnamese. That's all I did. I do remember those were the first men I ever killed, those were the first men I had ever killed, and I remember each one of them very distinctly. But if we hadn't killed them, they would have killed us. That's what I got that medal for. And I wish everybody who was there had gotten one too. And I wish everybody who was there had come home, as I did. I was a lucky guy. Anybody who made it out of Albany was a very lucky man.
Chapter 6, Tribute. When the first Cav shipped out in August 1965, some 7,000 military families were left behind. Of these, about 3,000 decided to stay in Columbus, Georgia, home to Fort Benning and the 1st Cavalry Division. Many of the families whose soldier husbands and fathers were leaving for Vietnam had been living in quarters on the main post. But within 30 days of a soldier's deployment, his family was required to vacate those quarters. Some wives took their children home, choosing to live with their own parents. A number of wives of senior NCOs and officers were successful in renting what housing was available in Columbus. So it was for Mrs. Imogene Ferrell and her 4 children, who moved to rental housing at 400 Olson Avenue in the city. In the days during and immediately following the battles at LZ X-Ray and LZ Albany, Mrs. Ferrell read of the heavy fighting at the foot of a mountain called Chupong, the Chupong Massif. In an article that appeared in the November 24, 1965 Rocky Mount, North Carolina Evening Telegram, she told of her reaction at that time, realizing full well that her husband's unit was engaged there. "I walked the streets all day," she said. "I don't know why I wasn't run over. When I got home, I tried to tell my children, 'You know your father is in the thickest fighting. He might not get back.'" Three days after the fighting at LZ Albany, on Saturday, November 20th, the official report of Platoon Sgt. William Ferrell's death reached U.S. Army Vietnam headquarters near Saigon. Late that same evening, facilitated by the 12 time zones that separated Saigon and Columbus, a cab driver appeared near midnight at 400 Olson Avenue with a telegram for Mrs. Imogene Ferrell. "I didn't have to read the telegram," she later told a reporter. "It was almost a relief to get it. It was like peace had settled. I could stop worrying. But it's hard to understand. He has gone." On Tuesday the 23rd, 2 days before Thanksgiving, the Pentagon released a new list of 39 men who had been killed in Vietnam. One entry read, "Sergeant William A. Ferrell, husband of Mrs. Imogene Ferrell, Columbus, Georgia." Sometime soon after, a photograph appeared over the newswire. In it, Mrs. Ferrell was showing one of her late husband's uniforms to their 4-year-old daughter, Cassie Jean. Platoon Sergeant William Ferrell was a member of the Presidential Honor Guard for the inauguration of President Johnson just 10 months earlier, and his widow told proudly of his Army record of more than 16 years, which was without a black spot. He did everything for his family, she added. Then she smiled. But we were second to the Army. A neighborhood boy called him the Old Sarge. Thanksgiving Day came on November 25th, and a second wire service photo the next day showed Mrs. Ferrell and her 4 children, Danny Lee, 17, David Earl, 15, Donna Elaine, 9, and Cassie Jean, all gathered around the table in their modest home for Thanksgiving dinner. An empty chair was left at the head of the table for their late soldier husband and father. Cassie Jean appeared to be offering a child's prayer of thanks in the photo. The day after Thanksgiving, an article appeared in the Brunswick, Georgia News. Widow is proud husband fought communists. I am more fortunate than some. Those were the words Mrs. William A. Ferrell, whose husband was killed in Vietnam less than a week ago, used Thursday to describe why she still had much to be thankful for, as the families of the men of the 1st Cavalry Division observed Thanksgiving. I feel I was never more blessed than at this moment. I am more fortunate than some because I have my family and so many friends. I had my husband for more than 20 years, and I have so many memories, Mrs. Ferrell said. The native of Brownsville, Tennessee said, I have no regrets. He wanted to be where he was, and I am proud that he was fighting the communists when he died. In Imogene Ferrell's hometown of Brownsville, Tennessee, the Weekly States Graphic reported on her husband William's death in its November 26th issue. The short page-one article was titled, County Native Killed in War. Word was received here this week that Platoon Sgt. William A. Ferrell, son of Harvey Ferrell, now of Crockett County, was killed on November 17 in action in Vietnam. Sergeant Ferrell was a member of the 3rd Indian Head Division and was killed along with his entire company. Raised in Haywood County, the 38-year-old soldier had 18 years of Army service and at one time lived near the Cocoa community. He is survived by his wife and 4 children of Columbus, Georgia, and a brother, James D. Ferrell of Bell Eagle Road. A few corrections to this 1965 article can be made today. First of all, before his battalion was renamed in July 1965, Platoon Sergeant Ferrell was with the 2nd Battalion, 9th Infantry Regiment, 2nd Infantry Division, also known as the Indian Head Division. His entire Alpha Company was not killed. Moore and Galloway list 34 members of Alpha Company, 2nd Battalion, 7th Cavalry, who were killed in action over October and November 1965. William Ferrell was not raised in Haywood County, but in neighboring Crockett County, and had 16, not 18 years of Army service. He and his family were living near the Cocoa community in Haywood County in 1950, and probably for a few years before. Finally, James D. Ferrell was William Ferrell's half-brother. The following Friday, December the 3rd, the Brownsville, Tennessee States Graphic carried a second short article on Platoon Sergeant Ferrell's death. Above his name and photo appeared the one-word title, Killed. This former resident of Haywood County was killed recently in Vietnam. Known here as Bully, Sergeant Ferrell was a member of the Honor Guard at President Johnson's inauguration. Ferrell has several relatives here, but maintained his residence in Georgia. On Monday, November 29, the first casualty from 1st Battalion, 7th Cavalry, Sergeant Jack Gell, was buried in the Fort Benning Main Post Cemetery. Sergeant Gell was killed in the fighting near LZ X-Ray on the afternoon of November 14th. His grave can be visited today in Section C2, grave number 258. Like Mrs. Ferrell, Mrs. Roger Nelson had been informed on November 20th of her husband's death at LZ Albany. A staff sergeant with Charlie Company, 2nd Battalion, 7th Cavalry, he had died on the 17th. On Sunday, December 5th, Staff Sergeant Roger Nelson was laid to rest in the Main Post Cemetery, Section C2, grave number 262. 11 days after Thanksgiving, on December 6th, there were at least 2 burials of 2nd Battalion, 7th Cavalry troopers at Fort Benning. Staff Sergeant Martin Knapp, Delta Company, 2nd Battalion, 7th Cavalry, had served more than 16 years in the Army. He was buried in Section C, grave 266. That same day, the flag-draped casket of Platoon Sergeant William Ferrell was carried from a hearse to his grave site in the Fort Benning Main Post Cemetery. Midway between fellow 2nd Battalion, 7th Cavalry troopers Roger Nelson and Martin Knapp, Pappy Ferrell was laid to rest in grave number 264, Section C2. A third wire service photograph shows Mrs. Ferrell clutching the flag from her husband's casket as she walks to a waiting car. A report that appeared over the newswire later that month on Christmas Eve told of how Platoon Sergeant Ferrell's devoted widow watched with dignity as his casket was lowered into the grave at the overcrowded cemetery that day. "He wanted me to be a good soldier," she said. "God knows I'm trying." The report continued. The flag was handed to her. She clutched it and then cried. By Christmas Day 1965, more than 100 Americans who had been killed in Vietnam were buried in the Fort Benning Main Post Cemetery. When retired Army Lieutenant General Hal Moore died in February 2017 at age 94, he was buried beside his wife Julie in the cemetery, Section C, grave 259, next to Sergeant Jack Gell, Alpha Company, 1st Battalion, 7th Cavalry, and near the graves of those other 1st Cavalry soldiers like Pappy Ferrell, who had followed him into the valley of the shadow of death, the Yadrang Valley.
We see also prominently before us, and walking to the microphone, is Mike Mansfield of Montana, the Majority Floor Leader of the United States Senate.
President and Mrs. Johnson, Mrs. Kennedy, members of the Kennedy family, my fellow Americans, all. There was the sound of laughter, and in a moment, it was no more. And so, she took a ring from her finger and placed it in his hands. There was a wit in a man, neither young nor old, but a wit full of an old man's wisdom and a child's wisdom. And then, in a moment, it was no more. And so she took a ring from her finger and placed it in his hands. There was a man, marked with the scars of his love of country, a body active with the surge of a life far from spent. And in a moment, it was no more. And so she took a ring from her finger and placed it in his hands. There was a father with a little boy and a little girl, and the joy of each in the other, and in a moment, it was no more. And so she took a ring from her finger and placed it in his hands. There was a husband who asked much and gave much, and out of the giving and the asking wove with a woman what could not be broken in life, and in a moment it was no more. And so she took a ring from her finger and placed it in his hands and kissed him and closed the lid of the coffin. A piece of each of us died at that moment. Yet in death, he gave of himself.